Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge and welcome to this video, which is going to be about this little monosynth here, the Evolver by Dave Smith Instruments. Now this little synth is 16 years old, and I thought that maybe before we go into the features of the synth and what it sounds like, it might be a good idea to take a brief look at what the synth market looked like back in 2002. What other synthesizers were out there, what was the technology that was being used, and see where the Evolver might have fitted into that market. So that's what's coming up next. Thanks very much for watching. Okay, so I've put together this little diagram showing some of the major synth releases that took place in the 5-year period leading up to 2002. It's not an exhaustive list at all, so please don't get angry if your favorite synthesizer is not shown here. It's just for illustration purposes only. And as you can see, the whole synth market is dominated by digital synthesizers, digital technology. There's quite a few German manufacturers here. You've got Access Music with their Virus range. You've got Quasi MIDI with their Polymorph Sirius. They'd already released through Evolution. And you've got Waldorf really pioneering wavetable synthesis in a convenient rack-mounted form. We've got the Microwave 2 XT, the Microwave was already released. We've got the Waldorf Q, and there's the Waldorf Pulse in there, which is actually an analog synth with digital control. So as you can see, Novation are a big player at the time, the Supernova 2, and the Little Nova desktop unit. Korg coming out with a variety of different digital technologies. They released the Electribe back in 1999, and EMU, a lot of EMU variations on their Proteus engine, and then they come out with their Morpheus, and then their XL7 and MP7 little desktop units. A lot of sample-based romplers that were quite popular at the time, and rack-mounted instruments were very, very popular at that time. So it's clear from that diagram that the synthesizer manufacturers were really embracing digital technology in a very, very big way. Very few analog synthesizers in that list. In fact, it was 2002, the same year that the Evolver was released, that Moog released their Voyager synth, and they hadn't released a synthesizer for, I believe, 20 years up until that time. Now, in terms of user interface and format of the synthesizers, the Evolver is a desktop synth, and that was quite unusual. Most of those synthesizers that I listed were actually rack-mounted. Rack mounting was very, very common, very, very popular. I think these days we're really quite easy to criticize a user interface. We criticize menu diving and stuff like that. Well, back then in the late 90s, we were really quite content to reach over to a rack and press a couple of little buttons and turn one encoder and go through millions of menu options and presets. Really, really quite a poor interface, but that was quite normal and accepted back then. I think Waldorf were the main company who were pioneering a new way of interacting with their synthesizers, and it's this matrix style of interaction that Dave Smith has used on his Evolver. So you've got a number of buttons down the side and a number of rotary encoders across the top, and by choosing a button combination, you select a row, and then you can change the parameter values that are listed on that row. Now, it's quite a dense matrix on the Evolver. There's an awful lot of things that you can change, but Waldorf have stuck with this matrix way of inputting and changing values. Even on their most recent synths, I've got here the Pulse 2. It's as well as the Blofeld, the Pulse 2 is the two current desktop offerings. And here we have the exact same matrix layout, buttons down the side to select a row, and then a bunch of encoders across the bottom here to change values. So they really have sort of like embraced the matrix way of inputting and changing values, and they've stuck with it all this time. Right, so while we're on the subject of how you interact with the synth, I have no problem at all personally with using this kind of matrix way of setting values. The only slight niggle I have with the evolver is that there is so much information here, there's so many values that you can change, that makes the writing on the synth really quite small, and I have to resort to using my reading glasses to actually see it properly. That's my only niggle with the evolver. But that having been said, I'm using the synth in my studio. I've got my computer screen right in front of me, my keyboard and my mouse, and so my preferred way of interacting with the synth is to actually use some software. The evolver software is really very good. You do have to pay for it, but it's not that expensive. It's got a very good logical layout. And what I'll do next is to show you that software, the website where you get it from, and talk through just a couple of the little sort of niggles and experiences that I had getting it to work with my particular computer and my particular DAW. So I'll cover that next. Right, here's the website that you need to go to get the software. It's called soundtower.com. They seem to support quite a few different synthesizers and instruments in terms of their editors and plugins and stuff. If I click on this Dave Smith Instruments link and then go to the Evolver Sound Editor link, here you can see that there's basically 3 flavors of software that you can choose from. There's the standalone editor for Mac and PC. It's 32-bit and 64-bit. There is a plugin for your DAW. Again, Mac and PC, 32-bit and 64-bit in VST and AU formats. And there's also a sound editor for iPad, although I have to admit I've not tried that software, so I'm not really going to talk about it. Right, let's have a look at the Evolver and its architecture, and I think one of the big selling points about the Evolver at the time that it was released was the fact that it was an analog and digital hybrid synthesizer. It has 2 analog oscillators. They're digitally controlled, so they're DSOs, but they're analog oscillators. It's got 2 analog low-pass filters. It's also got 2 digital, fully digital oscillators, and 2 digital high-pass filters. So let's listen to the analog side of things first. I've got here a very basic patch, and what I'm going to do is compare it to the Moog Grandmother that I've got over here. They're not going to sound exactly the same, identical, but hopefully kind of similar sounds. So I've just got both oscillators 1 and 2, which are the analog oscillators, at full level, and the digital oscillators are turned down. And I've got them very slightly detuned. Let's put them back to being precisely tuned. Very precisely tuned. There is a slop setting from 0 to 5, which will give a little bit of analog uncertainty. You can hear it's just starting to sort of like phase a bit as the oscillators drift. But it's not, it's subtle, it's not a severe setting. So if I do that and I just very slightly detune these guys, either way from 0, and then I've got a patch over here on the Grandmother. Just bring the sustain down. sounds a little bit too sloppy. So what I've got here in Cubase is just a very, very simple little sequence. I've put it here to run against the evolver, and then straight afterwards it'll run against the grandmother. Grandmother's a little warmer. Strange now. Get the idea. They sound very similar, or you can make them sound very similar. They're both two analog oscillators. Yes, they're not going to sound exactly the same, and you're going to have your preference. But at the end of the day, when you're taking a synth and you're putting it into a mix of a song, they're both capable of producing beautiful, warm, fuzzy analog sounds. And you know, this technology inside the Evolver, it is 16 years old. You could really call it a vintage synthesizer. It's that old. Okay, so let's have a look at the digital oscillators next. Those are oscillators 3 and 4. You can see here that there's a sort of like a graphic display of the wave shape that's available. And you hold down on the mouse and just sort of like move it up and down to scroll through them. So you'll see at the start we've got analog style waveforms, we've got sine, we've got sawtooth, we've got square, etc. And then we're into sort of wave table territory here. Apparently it's got all the same wave tables that the Prophet VS has. And you can also upload some of your own into memory as well. I don't know how to do that. I don't think that this editor supports it, but there must be some other way that the Evolver manual will tell you about. So let's just have a listen to them. Let's turn down the analog oscillators and just listen to oscillator 3. Sine wave. Sawtooth. Square wave. And then we're off into sort of organ sounds and bell sounds. Harmonically rich sounds. I'm not going to scroll through all of them, but what you can do is you can modulate which of the wave shapes is playing at any point in time, and you can do that through the sequencer. So I'm just going to show you that. We'll go to the sequencer by clicking on that button here, and here we've got the sort of like overall view of the 4 tracks of the sequencer, still with the sort of the main settings barely visible in very small font here on the right hand side. I'm going to go in and edit sequencer number 1, and I'm just going to choose pen as the draw mode so I can draw with my mouse. Just put some random numbers in there, come back out, go back to program, and then what we can do is we can set shape sequence. We can choose for oscillator 3 and 4 which, if any, of the tracks are and the sequencer will modulate the shape. So I'm going to set this to be sequence number 1, and then when I play the sequencer, you'll hear it doesn't change here graphically which one it's playing, unfortunately. That's a shame. but it's changing wave shapes on each note in the sequencer. So let's do something similar for oscillator 4. So we'll go to a different sequencer track. Let's go to sequencer 2. Still on pen. And then set it. Turn up the volume. Now there's an issue with my particular evolver, I think, is that the volume of the 4th oscillator is a lot lower than the others. I think it's a hardware fault with my particular synth. Now while we're on the subject of the sequencer, it's very, very, very powerful. So we've got 4 different sort of sequences, if you like, or 4 tracks to the sequencer. And there's an awful lot of things that each track can be modulating. If I just click here, you'll see this very, very long list. The frequency of the individual oscillators, their levels, pulse widths, FM, ring modulation, filter frequencies, resonance, high pass, panning. There's a whole control over the delay, the LFOs, frequencies and mounts, envelopes, mounts, attacks, decay, release. There's a whole load of stuff here that you can modulate, and the fact that you've got 4 oscillators and you've got 4 tracks to the sequencer, and you can individually be modulating a single oscillator's frequency, means that internally when you're using the sequencer, you've actually got a 4-note paraphonic synth at your disposal, or even a little bit better than paraphonic actually, considering you've also got control over other things. So if we were to look at a patch, there's a few example factory patches. Here's one, for example. I can see here in the sequencer section that each of the tracks is controlling a different oscillator. Oscillator 1, 2, 3 and 4 frequencies here. So let's listen to what this one sounds like. It's wonderful. And this is a mono synth. It's really quite crazy. If we look at the sequencer, and you'll see the individual tracks there. Let's go in and make them bigger. See, when you actually select in the editor, you select an oscillator frequency, rather than giving you numeric values, it actually shows you the notes, which makes it really easy and simple to choose nice notes in each track. So this is sequencer 1, sequencer 2, sequencer 3, etc. So that's one example. Let me go find another one. Yeah, this one. So all 4 oscillators are being used there, but as you'll see over here in the sequencer section, only 3 of the tracks are in use, and they are controlling oscillators 1, 2 and 3. Oscillator 4 is also being controlled, but it's actually being controlled by one of these sequences. If we look down here in the modulator section, you'll see that there's 4 different modulators. A modulator has a source, a destination, and then you've got a control to choose the amount. The 4th modulator down here, the modulation source is the sequencer track 3, and it is modulating oscillator 4 frequency. So this is a way to get one single set of notes in a track to modulate more than one thing more than one oscillator. So all 4 oscillators are being used. Let's choose just one more to have a look at, actually the very first one. So here we are, all 4 tracks are in use, and they're modulating each of the oscillators. This is a good example. You'll see here in the sequencer track edit that you've got RST for rest. So you can set a rest at any point within your sequence. But what you can also do is, if you have a rest and then the next note value is 0, then that indicates the end of that particular track. So tracks are 16 notes maximum in length, but here they've all been cut short to be shorter than 16. They've all got this rest and then a 0 note at the end. So these all happen to be the same length, but of course you could have them all different lengths for some really quite interesting sort of modulation effects. Okay, so one more little circuit inside the evolver that I want to take a look at, because I think it's really worth talking about for a while, is this one here. It's called a feedback or tunable feedback circuit. It first came out in a Dave Smith Instruments product in the evolver itself. It then was in the Poly Evolver, and it's actually in the Prophet 12 as well. So it is a circuit that he is sort of like, well, it's stood the test of time. He still likes to include it in his current lineup of synthesizers. And basically what it is, it's tunable. So it's got this really interesting quality. It can sort of like almost mimic the physical modeling of a string being plucked. So in this particular patch here, I've got the frequency of it all the way down to 0, but there's a level, so it's starting to be heard. If I turn it up too much, you'll actually hear it properly feeding back. So I've just got it on the edge of feedback, if you like. And I'm going to modulate the frequency of it using a sequencer track. As you can see up here, I've got the modulation destination being feedback frequency. So if we look at the track itself, you'll see that I'm just like iterating in a little sequence over the same set of values. And if I play that, turn up the volume, so we can hear it going through that sequence, and we're getting a tune, different pitches. Now we're not hearing the oscillators at all. If you look over here in the oscillator section, you'll see that they're all turned down to 0. So we're not hearing the oscillators, we're just purely hearing the feedback, a little bit like playing the resonance on a filter. Now what's triggering the notes is this envelope here. And this envelope is basically, as you can see, I've got a very, very sharp decay. It's just giving out a little pulse of noise. And that is enough to trigger the feedback in the sequence. So if we change the shape of this envelope, we'll hear it change the characteristic of the sound. Well, to be honest, I could spend hours, if not days, if not weeks, playing around with this synth. It's really very, very deep. There's so much to it, and there's a lot that I haven't covered. There's the delay circuit. There's the whole stereo concept inside here. You know, there's a reason why there's two analog oscillators, two digital oscillators, two analog low pass filters, two high pass filters. It's because of the stereo nature of the circuitry inside the synthesizer. It's really, that for me is really quite revolutionary. I could go on, but I think this video's got quite long already. I mean, really, to sum up the synthesizer, I would say that it's absolutely fantastic, and I don't know why I passed it by 16 years ago. I just don't know why. I was trying to think why. But I'm very, very glad that I found it after all this time. Will I use it for everything that I do? No, I won't. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, because I think it's a synth that you really get the best out of it by just like losing yourself in it and noodling with it. So therefore, if you've got a certain sound in mind, it's probably not the synth to go to. It's the synth to go to when you probably looking for inspiration and looking for ideas and looking for something different to come up with. And the other reason I wouldn't use it all the time is because it really is showing its age. I think this one's got a couple of problems. One of the oscillators really is quite sort of low in volume compared to the other ones, and I do get some noise leaking through into one of the channels. So it's showing its age. The sound quality isn't fantastic. But it really is a fantastic synth, and I think that its strength lies in its built-in sequencer, and building something, you know, like using it like a groove box. Basically, I was trying to think of sort of competition for it, and the quasi-MIDI polymorph is kind of similar in that nature. It's just like a standalone unit. It's a synth-based, sequence-based unit. Where you just sit down with it, you don't need anything else, and you can build tracks and build interesting, musical sequences. And this Evolver sort of does the same thing. So that's really it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. And until the next time, thanks very, very much for watching.